In this example, we're given an equation for the demand curve right here and an equation for the supply curve right here. And we're asked to figure out the consumer and producer surplus and the total surplus for this market when it's in equilibrium. So let's start by drawing out what we have. So quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. And then for our demand curve, the y-intercept is 76, so that's what we start at up here, and the slope is -8. So I never really draw this stuff to scale, so something downward sloping. There's our demand curve. Our supply curve has a y-intercept of 6, so it starts at 6, right? It doesn't start at 0, but at 6, and has a positive slope of 2. So there's our supply curve, and of course we know that our equilibrium will be where the two intersect, where supply equals demand. So this will be our Q star, or equilibrium quantity bought and sold, and this will be the equilibrium price that gets us to that balance between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. All right, so before we solve for anything numerically, let's just talk about consumer and producer surplus. So consumer surplus is the difference from any transaction. Let's say this one right here, let's say this is the third transaction. Consumer surplus is the difference between what the consumer actually pays for the product, P star, versus the maximum they'd be willing to pay, which is given by whatever their marginal value or marginal benefit of that third unit would be, right? So this distance between the demand curve and the price line, that's consumer surplus. And so that's going to happen for the first transaction, the second, the third, all the way to Q star. So we can label this whole triangle as the consumer surplus. And then similarly, for producers, their surplus, the welfare gain that they have, is measured for any particular transaction as the difference between the price they get for the product up here versus what the minimum price they were willing to sell the product for is, right? So remember, the supply curve represents that minimum price they would be willing to sell at, because the supply curve represents the marginal cost of producing the product. So sellers are willing to sell at a price that will at least cover that cost, right? If they get something above that, like P star, then they're really happy, right? So that's going to happen for every single transaction. So for the first transaction, this distance here will be the producer surplus. For the second transaction, this distance here between price and supply, and so on. For the third transaction, this distance here will be the producer surplus, and so on until we get out to Q star, right? So we can label this triangle here the producer surplus. It's all that space below the price but above that supply curve, right? And notice that we really should never see the market go beyond Q star, because once we get beyond Q star, the supply curve is higher than the demand curve. So that means that minimum price that sellers require to sell their product is higher than what the consumers value the product at. So we really shouldn't see buyers and sellers acting way out here on this side of the graph, because that would mean that the price is such that either the buyer or the seller is worse off. All right, so back to the question though. So our task here is to calculate this actual consumer surplus triangle and producer surplus triangle. So to do that, we need to know what is the area of a triangle? So that's given by the formula 1/2 base times height. So here's the height, here's the base or the width, right? And to be able to use that formula, we need to know what the height is. So we need to solve for this number, P star, and we need to know what the width of this triangle is. So we need to solve for Q star. All right, so let's do that. Let's start by solving for equilibrium. So we'll set supply equal to demand. So we take our supply equation, set it equal to our demand equation. And then we solve. So let's see, that becomes 10Q is equal to 70. Divide both sides by 10, so Q star is 7. So we can label that there. And then P star, right, to get that, we just take this 7 and we plug it in either here into the supply curve or here into the demand curve. And either one will give us the same answer. So I'm going to do the supply curve because it's just looks a little simpler to me. So 2 times 7 is 14, plus 6 makes 20. So the equilibrium price over here is $20. All right, so now we're ready to calculate our consumer surplus and our producer surplus. So let's start with consumer surplus. So we could do it for every single transaction separately, but that would be really time consuming to figure out all those numbers. So instead we just use the equation for the area of a triangle, which is 1/2, times the base, which would be from 0 to Q star, right? The base is from here all the way to here. So from 0 to Q star. So let's add that into our formula. So 7. And then times the height of the triangle. So the height is from 76 down to P star, which is 20. So let's add that. 76 minus 20. Right, so we get, if we work that all out, we get 196. All right, so the consumer surplus is equal to 196. And now for the producer surplus, similarly, we're going to rely on the formula for an area of a triangle. So 1/2 times the width of the triangle, again, is 7. There are 7 transactions. And for each transaction, the surplus generated is the difference between the price and the supply curve, right? So the height here of this triangle is from 20 to 6. So from 20 to 6. All right, so when we work that out, we end up with 49. Right, so we can see that the consumer surplus is higher than the producer surplus in this example. However, both sides do benefit, and so both sides are happy by the fact that these transactions are occurring. All right, finally, we can calculate total surplus, which just adds up consumer surplus and producer surplus, right? So it's going to be this whole triangle. Right, and so that's just 196 from the consumers and 49 from the producers for a total of 245. So you can think of this market as generating $245 worth of total surplus or welfare.